7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Satellite communications plays an integral part in our day-to-day lives. We owe a great deal, however, to the early pioneers of communication, such as Morse and Marconi. In this first videotape, Bob Hoskins talks about the early days of communications through to the development of television. Bob also discusses the earliest low-level satellite communication systems, as well as the Clark Belt, geosynchronous orbits, and the NASA TDRS tracking system.
Man's need to communicate has been with us almost since the beginning of mankind itself. In the days of the Roman legions, a soldier was used to carry information by running from the battlefield to the commanders in the rear area. And this continued to be the primary means of communications from the time of the Romans all the way through until the Civil War. And even at the Civil War, the primary means of communications was still the soldier on horseback carrying messages from the battlefield to the commanders in the rear area. Although a new technological development had occurred that brought in a new wave of communications. It was actually the beginning of electronic communications. An invention of electromagnetism had been around for some time. However, Samuel Morse came up with a method of taking these clicks and pauses from when you energize and de-energize a magnetic circuit and change that to where you could actually communicate through the Morse code in a series of dits and dashes. It wasn't very long until the limitations of the telegraph of the Civil War became quite limited, and they needed much more than what transmission of information over wires alone could help. One instance was transoceanic traffic. They had a telegraph wire that went from the United States to the continent of Europe, but they weren't able to transmit enough message traffic to be able to satisfy the needs of the populace at that time. So an Italian gentleman by the name of Marconi went to work on a wireless method of transmission. He reasoned that if you could transmit over wires, you should also be able to do it over wireless. After all, there's been a phenomenon that they had known for years that existed in nature, that is static electricity created by lightning and what have you. They could pick that up and hear it with what they called a detector with an earphone. They were actually able to hear lightning over the air, but they didn't know how to use that or anything about it. So Marconi took this static electricity and he found a way through using arc gaps and telegraph keys to actually control the power of nature in the form of static electricity and broadcast it in a series of dots and dashes. This method of transmitting information through controlled lightning, if you will, worked quite effectively, except it was so broadbanded. That means that it takes up so much of the airspace to transmit the message. There again, you're limited as to how many messages that you can send. So they developed a method of transmitting audio or sound tones instead of controlled static. That allows you to take the communications and put it into a much narrower area of space in the air. And it was then that through the use of this type of transmitting sounds of dots and dashes, they were able to effectively communicate now between Earth stations and ship stations out at sea. And this was brought about by the need of helping to ensure the safety of the many passengers that went across the ocean in these ships. The original radio that Marconi did his broadcasts on took the space of almost an entire room. This is a radio transceiver with which I can communicate almost 100 miles in any direction. Okay, this is the battery pack that goes on the radio, so you can see how small the actual radio transceiver is. I put this in and I can turn it on. And I'm going to give you a demonstration of what Morse code sounds like over the radio today, which is a far cry from the controlled static of Marconi's experiments. Now that's a radio repeater that is somewhere other than where I'm at now. But with this mountaintop repeater that is about 60 miles from where I am now, I can broadcast or transmit messages with this small little handheld radio from anywhere from 100 to 200 miles away. I can go almost 100 miles in this direction, 100 miles in this direction with this little transceiver through the use of a mountaintop repeater. Now that mountaintop repeater is very similar in operation to the satellite repeater that we're going to talk about in a little bit, except that it's on a mountaintop and it's a little more local. However, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. It wasn't very long after they finally got the point-to-point Morse code wireless type broadcasting perfected and in use that they realized that there was a lot more that they could use wireless broadcasting for. Up until this point, all of our wireless radio was used for broadcasting from a trained operator at this end to another trained operator at this end. And they did it all in Morse code. Well, with other inventions of, say, the vacuum tube and other devices, they were able to start broadcasting with voice. And with this, they were able to send music over the air. And in the 1920s, they started developing the commercial broadcast system where they were able to broadcast. Most of the early broadcasts were done from hotels and storefronts, and they were able to broadcast music and entertainment over the air. This was the beginning of electronic entertainment as we know it today. These early radio plays and orchestra performances were actually a new way or a new beginning for what was going to happen in television. Because television, as it started in the late 40s and early 50s, was all live. They had to do everything live because they had no way of recording the television picture and everything at that time. They did have what they call kinescope, where they would actually film the performance as it would happen, but the picture quality was so poor that it was only kept mainly as a record of what went on instead of a primary mode of broadcast. So in order to get the television pictures from one city to another, in order to have a large audience, they used what they called the television network, and they sent the signals from one city to the other using what they call microwave relay stations, and they would send it from mountaintop to mountaintop until they were able to connect each of the cities. And all of the broadcasts were done live. If they made a mistake, it was on the air as it was made. They didn't have any editing or anything else. And this made it kind of difficult to transmit and keep all of the TV pictures together. There were a lot of, as a young child, I remember watching a television show and seeing this sign, network difficulties. Well, we hardly ever see this today on television, and that's because we use satellite transmission, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. As I was telling you, the early network programming was broadcast by terrestrial microwave. That's microwave transmission station to station on Earth. And these relay stations are actually on top of high mountains. So they're able to transmit from city to city by relay. And the big drawback is that if a heavy weather system moves in between one relay, or if there's a breakdown of the equipment, any link in the chain would cause the picture to go down, and they could lose city after city after city because of one piece of equipment. This is the reason why when I was a small child watching network television, we saw something that we rarely see these days, and that was a slide up on the screen that said network difficulties. We rarely see that now because most networks use satellite telecommunications for the relay now instead of these terrestrial Earth microwave stations. But in the very early days of satellite communications, instead of having one satellite way high up over the Earth's equator that could stay in line with the Earth, broadcasting a consistent signal and everything, they had the Earth ringed with, say, 3 low-level satellites, and it goes something like this. We'll look at the globe, and they would place a satellite into orbit very close to the Earth's surface. Now, a current communications satellite today travels about 25,000 miles above the Earth's equator. But in the early days of communications satellite, it would rotate above the Earth at only a couple of hundred miles. Now, in order to stay in Earth's orbit, the satellite would have to be moving much faster, as shown by my finger. It would move much faster than the rotation of the Earth. So you couldn't stay synchronized with any one position. So in order to be able to use that early communication satellite, you would have to have 2 antennae to track the satellite. And what you'd have is you'd have one antenna that would catch the satellite as it came up over the Earth's surface, and it would track the satellite as it goes across the sky. And about the time it gets to the low point here, this satellite is just about ready to see sunset and go on the other side of the Earth, and the next satellite comes up over the Earth. So you have a second antenna that picks up and tracks that satellite as it goes over. Now, while this antenna is slowly tracking the next satellite, the other antenna is coming back over, and when this satellite reaches its edge and starts going over the edge of the Earth, the third satellite starts coming up over the Earth's horizon, and then they're tracking. And then when this finishes, the second antenna is repositioned, and then the first satellite comes up again. So you see where you could have 3 satellites give continuous coverages by tracking these with 2 separate antennas. Well, this was costly, and it was also difficult to track the satellites, and it could not come in general widespread use. So they developed another method called geosynchronous orbit, which we're going to talk to you again in a moment about. I was just able to communicate with my handheld through that mountaintop repeater again. It's pretty reliable communications because that repeater is on top of a mountaintop, and my signal from my handheld can reach it easily every time because we know where it's at. As I was telling you a few moments ago about the low-level satellites and having to track them around the Earth, it makes it quite difficult because with the directional signals with a satellite, you have to be able to hit that satellite right on. And with having to track 2 or 3 satellites all the time, continuous communications can be quite difficult. The ideal situation is to be able to hang that satellite in one location and be able to find it at any time of day, or just about any period of time, and to make sure that it stays there during the whole time that you're trying to communicate. We have a globe here, and there's some little wooden pegs around here that depict satellites that are basically hung in orbit over the Earth about 22 to 25,000 miles over the equator. This is a belt known as the Clark Belt that was theorized by a writer and a scientist in 1945, Arthur C. Clarke, and he theorized that if you put a satellite at the right distance over the Earth, the velocity that it took to orbit the Earth and to hold it away from the Earth would be the same velocity as, if it's out there that far, as the Earth would rotate. So as you can see here with the globe, with the Earth actually rotating, you can see that the satellites are staying fixed in its relationship to Earth as the Earth is rotating about on its axis. Okay, this is known as the Clark Belt, and it's in this region that all of our current geosynchronous satellites are in orbit today. I'd like to show you a little bit more about how this Clark Belt works.
The one on the left sort of kind of windier looking. Take the left one.
Whoops, you caught me. I'm working my handheld transceiver again with a mountaintop repeating station quite a few miles away. As you can see, I can communicate effectively with that small little transceiver quite a few miles away, because that mountaintop transmitter receiver or relay station is always at the same point at the same time. And I know I can hit it with that repeater, and from this place I can talk and everything else. Now, I was telling you a few minutes ago about the low-level Earth orbit type communication satellites and the difficulty in tracking them. It makes the use of that satellite very expensive and sometimes unreliable for general usage. So the only real effective way to have satellite communications is to be able to put that satellite in one location where it's predictable, you can always go find it, and you don't have to track it constantly. Well, we know that it's possible to place a satellite in that type of Earth orbit because of the work of Arthur C. Clarke in the mid-1940s. He defined what we call the Clarke Belt. It's a point over the Earth's equator about 22 to 25,000 miles above the equator, at which point a satellite can be placed in orbit and travel at a forward speed at a velocity that will allow it to remain in a fixed position over the Earth at all times. Okay, I'd like to be able to make that concept a little bit firmer for you. This is a toy you all recognize. It's a top, right? It's a yo-yo. Anyhow, a lot of you sit here and go up and down with it and play with them and do tricks with them. I'm going to do a little bit of a trick here to explain to you how the Clarke Belt works. Now, suppose this yo-yo is the Earth, and then we follow this string out all the way this far. You can see how big a diameter that is. And then you follow out here, and if we put a little bit of a point of a pen or a pencil on the end of this string, that would be the satellite. Very, very, very tiny. But the string shows the relationship of the satellite over the Earth. Okay? Now, that's about how far away the satellite is from Earth. Okay? Now, that's in the Clarke Belt. How does the Clarke Belt work? Well, take this yo-yo, and I'm going to start spinning it. Now, I'm going to spin it over my head. And as I spin it over my head, you can see that I have to spin it pretty fast to keep it from staying straight out. Okay, what happens is that if I spin it hard enough to have enough centrifugal force, the centrifugal force will hold the yo-yo out away from my finger and make it straight. It'll crack you on the head, too, if you're not careful. Okay, now, as you can see, I had to go pretty fast. If I tried to spin that fast to keep that thing standing straight out, if that's short, that close to my head, it wouldn't work. But how about if I make it a further distance out and hold it away from my nose? Okay, if I just stand here, all I'm going to be able to do is look down there and see a yo-yo. Okay, however, if I spin fast enough, this yo-yo will actually hold out straight out from my face. Now, pretend my head is the Earth, and I'm going to start spinning this yo-yo. Okay, if I rotate at the speed that the Earth is rotating at, now you can see that the yo-yo is now straight out from my face. And as I rotate, the yo-yo maintains a fixed relationship from my face. I'm going to stop or I'm going to fall over. Oh, I get dizzy. Okay, now when you were watching that yo-yo, you were seeing a yo-yo spin around and around. But all I was seeing when I was going around, besides a blurred background and my stomach getting really queasy, I could see a yo-yo standing straight out from my nose. Okay, that's because for the right distance, I was turning the right speed to have the centrifugal force hold that yo-yo out. Okay, same thing happens with these satellites. Okay, I have some wooden pegs here painted white that will depict satellites. When you have these satellites go out from Earth at the exact right distance, and they're traveling at their exact right, or I should say correct, at the exact correct velocity, forward velocity, what will happen is that just like the yo-yo stands out from my nose, the satellite stands out from the equator. And as I rotate, the satellite remains in a fixed location over the equator. It'll only work in the Clark belt, and it'll only work over the equator because it has to be central to the axis of rotation. Okay, in doing this, then as the Earth rotates, we have the satellites remaining in a fixed position over the Earth. And if I position myself somewhere over here on the west coast, let's see, I'm going to pick San Francisco. And if I'm right here at San Francisco looking out, I could, if my eyes were good enough, I could actually see a satellite 25,000 miles over the Earth, 22 to 25,000 miles over the Earth. And because it is rotating and moving in this direction at the same speed for that distance as the Earth is rotating, it doesn't move in relationship to me in San Francisco. Now that is the principle that makes geosynchronous satellites. That's a new term. Geosynchronous means that it stays in a fixed relationship with the Earth's rotation. That geosynchronous orbit is what makes it possible for that satellite to always be at the same place at the same time, so that the antenna on Earth doesn't have to move or rotate in order to see that satellite.
Tracking and data satellites for both commercial and military applications play an important part in the overall telecommunications technology industry. NASA, our National Space Agency, has recently launched several new communication satellites for their own use. Let's take a look at how they operate.
Okay, the TDRS system was designed to replace a worldwide network of tracking stations that had been used prior to the development of the spacecraft technology to get all the tracking data and all of the scientific data back from NASA spacecraft. With the TDRS satellite, which is owned and operated for NASA by Contel, we're up in geosynchronous orbit, and we see the entire Earth. We're high enough up so that the whole Earth is visible to the spacecraft. Before NASA got into the use of the TDRS system, all of the contact with the space shuttle and other low-orbiting spacecraft was done through ground stations, which were in very, very short periods of contact with the shuttle. The fundamental geometry of the situation limited viewing time between the ground network, which was providing the tracking and data services, and the space shuttle. Once we have the TDRS on orbit, now we have essentially continuous coverage from the space shuttle and other low-orbiting spacecraft relayed through the tracking data relay satellite to our ground station at White Sands, New Mexico.
The TDRS system plays a vital function in the successful operation of the Space Shuttle program. The technology and principles of operation NASA uses were developed using the same basic technology that PaxCOMM uses. Now let's look at the TDRS satellite itself.
It is indeed one of the largest communication satellites that was ever built. From tip to tip of the solar panels, which provide the power to the spacecraft, it's over 60 feet long, which is sort of the length of a good-sized house, as a matter of fact, and runs about 50 feet across the two main antennas. Now, from the point of view of the mission requirements, these gold meshed antennas are the things that are really important to NASA. They track the space shuttle and whatever other low-orbiting spacecraft we have to track as it travels across the Earth disk. This antenna, in turn, provides a relay of all of the signals from the low-orbiting spacecraft to our ground station at White Sands, New Mexico. But we have a second system which uses an array of 24 small antennas to provide continuous and simultaneous coverage to up to 20 additional spacecraft. So the communications channel capacity of this spacecraft is as impressive as its physical size.
The ground station at White Sands, New Mexico is the final link in the TDRS system. These dishes are over 100 feet in size and automatically monitor the TDRS satellites. All of the TDRS tracking and data relay satellites are sent into orbit by the space shuttle. The satellite is placed in the shuttle in a collapsible form, cylindrical to match that of the cargo bay. The TDRS satellite is then ejected from the space shuttle and placed into a low orbit. After the satellite has moved a safe distance away from the space shuttle, the payload assist motor is fired, placing the TDRS satellite into geosynchronous orbit. This is the end of tape 1. In our second video lesson tape, we'll take a look at how the communication satellite is placed in orbit by both the space shuttle and air launch systems, as well as uplink and downlink technology.